Chapter 8 Sakura Blossom. His eyes were immediately drawn upwards. Across the domed ceiling stretched a massive fresco, the colors aglow in the glimmering lamplight, the blues impenetrable, the yellows chaotic, the reds primal. He knew the scene depicted, the tragedy of Demonculus. Once he and Ray had read the story from a leather-bound book, their heads almost touching over the page, the candle slumping down to the floor as the night deepened. It had been a school night, and they hadn't wanted to risk turning any gas lamps on, lest the greater light attract the servants at a time when they were supposed to be asleep. In the fresco, Demonculus stood over the mangled corpse of the Ericid Titan, the 100 arms broken, the 100 eyes weeping blood, the Titan's entrails like a swarm of snakes cascading into the shallow river. For 7 days and 7 nights they'd battled, Demonculus finally prevailing as dawn broke on the 8th day. In his arms he held the broken body of his wife, the Lady Mororis, who, fearing for his safety, had strayed too close and perished as he struck the final killing blow. Mitsue gazed up into Demonculus's visage, the plaster cracked with time, setting wrinkles into the ageless oil and pigment, and tried to read the emotions there. He knew what he was supposed to see. In the tale, Demonculus was so consumed by wrath at the death of his wife that he destroyed the city of Persephoid, the city he'd fought to save. But strangely, it wasn't wrath that Mitsue saw. Anguish, grief, rage, they were all there. But staring upwards, he saw something else too. Something that seemed not to belong in the whorls of those crystal blue eyes. Something like fear. Mitsue allowed his eyes to fall. The rest of the room was similarly opulent. Crisp white plaster curving like puffs of cloud. Gold filigree tracing down the walls. A golden hearth in which a fire burned. A study, perhaps, for it had a dark desk in one corner surrounded by bookshelves that flowed upward along the back wall, curving together like a double helix, a spiral ladder set on wheels in one corner. On the desk was an alabaster globe detailing the known world, the countries inlaid with mother of pearl. Beside it lay several golden instruments with which Mitsue was unfamiliar, though he thought they might be used for navigation at sea. It was the center of the room, though, that most firmly drew his attention. There 2 mats had been laid, the furniture pushed aside, and on those 2 mats... No. 2 figures lay side by side. An old man labored over the closest figure, bent down, his back to Mitsue, his hands alight with flickering indigo flames. He turned at Mitsue's approach and stood and rested his arms against his sides. His face reminded Mitsue of a road in spring, after the endless thaws and freezes of winter have ceased, when the cobblestone is left pitted and cracked. Laugh lines cut his cheeks and creased the folds round his lips. He wasn't smiling now, yet there was tenderness in his hazel eyes. He wore the black and red of a kindler, except with flashes of white at the hems and along the hood and down the sleeves. Mitsue was unfamiliar with their meaning. "I've done what I can for them," the old man began, which was precious little. "Wounds inflicted by the sacred fire are beyond our arts to heal." "Sacred fire?" Mitsue said, the words barely escaping the vortex of his lungs. "They were burned?" The old man nodded. How? It didn't make sense. Iridescent, his dream flashed across the canopy of his mind, a whirlpool of flame churning around him. But it was just a dream, wasn't it? "May I see your hand?" the man asked. "I don't," Mitsue began. The old man persisted. "This will only take a moment." Mitsue offered him his right hand. "I will need your left," the old man said. Mitsue did as he was bidden. Since the night Sotsu burned, Mitsue had borne a burn scar in the center of his left hand. But now as the old man turned his hand palm side up, he saw that there, where the scar should have been, instead was the kindler's stigmata, the shape of an unfolding flower or a raging fire, the pink flesh raw as if freshly branded. The old man released him. "You know what this is, I take it?" he asked. Bewildered, Mitsue nodded. "It's the mark of our covenant with the sacred fire," the man said, lowering his hand so that Mitsue could see the identical mark he bore. "How?" Mitsue stammered. He couldn't have a stigmata. He'd failed his exam. Every child in Anglia underwent the examination at 9. He remembered his own, a month before Ray's, since he was older. A kindler came to the house. She asked Mitsue his name. She took a black cauldron with a skeletal face from her bag and placed it on the table. Then with a silver knife she made an incision in the center of Mitsue's palm, right where he'd been burned, and when the blood turned to fire in the depths of the cauldron, she plunged Mitsue's hand into it. It was over so quickly, The kindler conducting the test had nodded when no stigmata appeared on Mitsue's hand. Figures, she'd said then, looking at Dr. Ashford as she spoke. Impossible that a hawker would manifest a stigmata. Impossible that he would be a bearer. Ray had laughed when she found out. You can't ignite, you can't ignite, you can't ignite, she'd sang, marching around the backyard. Just wait until my exam, she'd said, her voice bright. I'll show you how it's done. Of course, when the time came, she didn't manifest the stigmata either. On occasion, the exam may offer a false negative, the old man said, returning Mitsue to the study, to the present. Our methods are imperfect. He scratched the side of his head. I'll admit the manifestation of a stigmata at your age is unusual, perhaps unprecedented, though, of course, I'm no expert. That said, a life or death situation can sometimes cause latent powers to surface. Mitsue stared at the stigmata in his palm, a host of emotions racing across the dim plane of his mind. He saw the attic above Abbess Carmine's office once more, the noctura flowing upward through the trapdoor. If I had been able to ignite back then, to control it, he thought. He saw himself, palms raised, pillars of fire rising all around him, the noctura spilling back into the shadows. I could have saved them. Into his mind came the terrified faces of Ernley and Krista and Ray. Then he thought of Abbess Carmine and the other children in the entrance hall, their lives trickling red into the cracks of the stone. I could have saved all of them. But he took a deep breath. A cold rush of guilt extinguished the fantasy. What am I thinking? He couldn't be a bearer, couldn't be a kindler. Not after everything. They destroyed his country, his family, set fire to the life he was meant to live, stolen from him everything he'd ever loved. He remembered his father sitting on the tatami floor beside him, remembered his voice coloring the night dark. In a moment he'd leave, slide shut the door, a final smile on his lips. He'd don his armor, his kabuto, his haidate, his kote, his tsuneate, his do, and all the rest, his katana and wakizashi at his waist, step out into the dark, and Mitsue would never see him again. But now, just for an instant, he told a familiar story, a story he told 1,000 times before, and Mitsue listened, wondering all the while what his father was thinking, and why he had to leave. No, that wasn't true. He'd seen his father once more. The memory broke open, full of fire and smoke and screams. Don't look, his mother whispered into his ear. Mitsue closed his eyes, a bitter taste clinging to his tongue, his breathing uneven, the strings of his heart trembling. What did he fight for? What did he die for? If I become one of them. He stared at the mark in his palm, the power of fire, of life and death, branded into his skin, the color and shape of cherry blossoms in spring. Such a small thing, he thought, such a small thing to cause so much suffering. And the old man's words returned to him. Wounds inflicted by the sacred fire are beyond our arts to heal. Comprehension gushed into his brain. Then it was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He struggled to draw breath. Everything else poured from him, his hopes, his guilt, as if a cork had been pulled till he was empty save this one thought. It was me, he said, his voice little more than a whisper. He let the words steep in the air. With great solemnity, the old man nodded. His dream had been real, the sweltering heat like smelter winds, the flames arcing over his head. He pushed past the old man. On the mat before him, Ernley lay unconscious. From the right side he looked almost as he did ordinarily, his brown hair handsomely untidy, his marble white skin smooth and unblemished. But all Mitsue needed to do was crane his head slightly to see Ernley's left side. Cooked meat. That's all he could think of, a black and red mess of seared flesh. Cracked, oozing, tendrils of bubbling skin spiraling across his cheek and down his neck to his shoulder. His clothes had burned away on the side, revealing beneath a mat of red blisters that stretched down his arm all the way to his hand. No. Krista lay to Ernley's right, and Mitsue moved to her in a daze, barely registering what he saw. She seemed to have avoided the worst of it. In his memory she was cowering behind Ernley. Still, Mitsue felt a cold terror sluicing through his chest as he looked down into her small face. Her right eyelid had been seared, her scalp looked bald and shiny. Angry red pustules where her hair had been. Mitsue squeezed his eyes shut. It was me. When he opened them again, the charred remnants of Ernley and Krista were still there on the mats, their breathing slow and labored. "Why haven't they woken?" he asked in a whisper. "They've been given medicine to keep them asleep, allow their bodies time to heal. They will recover, not entirely, but some." The old man paused, as if weighing his words, then said carefully, "I'm afraid there's more." Mitsue had known this was coming, dreaded it, avoided it, locked it away. His blood jumped up through the valves of his heart, his throat twisted shut. Ray.